喂喂喂喂喂喂喂喂，
排位置了吧？
还有耳机吗？
还没有。
好，各位同学，我们的课程马上要开始了，大家还请大家把手机置于关闭或静音状态。那么今天我们请到2位顾问委员会委员，走进我们清华经管学院企业家学者项目1到4次的课堂。今天有2位委员是我们千里院长，这也是吸引我们今天这个课堂。今天主持课堂的是我们清华大学经管学院常务副院长，也是江塘副委员会委员，全国政治理事长，来有请宣老师为我们今天的顾问委员走进清华经管白老师
来了。
好，谢谢大家，下午好。尊敬的 Spence 教授，尊敬的 Bristol 先生，亲爱的同学们、老师们，下午好。1年1度的顾问委员进课堂活动今天再次隆重进行。今天下午的课堂主要有主题讲演、主题对话、互动问答这几个环节构成。邀请了2位顾问委员走进我们企业家学者项目的课堂。首先，请允许我介绍一下今天第1位走进企业家学者课堂的顾问委员 Michael Spence 教授。Michael Spence 教授在纽约大学斯敦商学院任教，2000年获得诺贝尔经济学奖。Michael Spence 教授以及另外2位获奖获得者，在不对称信息市场分析领域的开创性研究，构成了现代信息经济学的核心。此外 ，Michael Spence 教授关于信号传递模型的研究，也对博弈论产生了深远的影响。下面，请同学们用最为热烈的掌声欢迎 Michael Spence 教授。
pleased to be here. This is my first meeting, having just joined the advisory board, and it's a great honor to be part of this group. So my assignment today is to talk a little bit about the state of the global economy, and particularly about the relationship between the two big economies in the world, the United States and China. I think, just to skip to the bottom line, we're entering a very, very difficult period. There is no question that the developed countries, to varying degrees, are not only experiencing what I have come to think of and describe as a sort of unfortunate low-growth equilibrium. Let me explain that. For much of the past 8 years, the discussion around economic performance in the developed countries has focused on the notion of a very long and difficult recovery. That's different from settling into a low-growth equilibrium. That's not a recovery anymore. That's really a different pattern. Now, we could spend a lot of time sort of, worrying about the reasons for this. I think they're actually relatively simple. First, our growth patterns, and this is particularly true of the United States, have been characterized by rising inequality, which I think is in various different transmission mechanisms affecting economic performance. But we are also, and here I include Europe, which is in much worse shape, and Japan, which is struggling with its own issues. We are way too heavily reliant on monetary policy without complementary reforms in fiscal and structural areas. I think this is getting to be a widely held view, but as the way I've characterized this low-growth equilibrium is no single entity, actor, whether it's a central bank or a country or whatnot, can actually get out of this on their own. So consider the United States Central Bank, which is called the Federal Reserve. They can accept the proposition that repressing the savings side of the economy indefinitely has high and rising costs, a chorus that you now hear regularly. But then you ask yourself the question, given that we are short on public sector investment, given that we don't have tax reform, given that we have very high degrees of uncertainty that are depressing at least some aspects of private sector investment. I think this is true much beyond the United States, but clearly, responsible executives are looking at the picture that we face economically and politically and saying, it's probably better to wait than sort of, take the plunge right now. So the central bank's sitting there, they can raise the interest rates. They probably will produce an asset price reset downward if they do it, because the asset prices are essentially now responding to very low interest rates and discount rates and driving people on purpose, by the way, into the higher risk asset classes. And they can probably raise the exchange rate and also depress the tradable side of the economy a little bit. And then they will be held responsible, for a downturn in the economy, when in fact the situation that they're in is that there isn't anybody on board. My friend Muhammad Al-Arian has written a rather good book on this called The Only Game in Town, in which he talks about what the world looks like from a macroeconomic point of view when you have the dominant policy actors being the central banks, at least in the developed countries. I flew in this morning from Milan by Frankfurt and got caught in the traffic jam, which was fortunate because I didn't have to look at the debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. I have watched the other two debates, and at some cost, by the way, to the person in the morning in Milan. Let me comment on that, because I think it directly affects the relationship. The bad news is that both of these candidates are deeply unpopular. It now looks like the result, barring a kind of upset, That will make,
这是英文数据
at least from the point of view of the behavior of the United States internationally, a little bit more predictable. But let me say this, we have a kind of burgeoning problem of sort of alienation in a number of countries. It's, I think, not completely understood, but surely related to rising inequality of income, wealth, and opportunity. And it's been an unaddressed problem. And so, while I think many people look at the American process, in many ways, it's church. In fact, I think the fact that people finally come to it, and are saying, this is not okay. These road patterns are not inclusive. And we have to find a way to and I think that's a good thing. Now, it can lead to highly populist and destructive policies, both domestically and externally. So there's risks associated with this. But at least, you have in the United States and in Europe with populist policy, and politics on both the right and the left, sort of finally emerging. Now, so the hopeful version of this is that now that this is out in front, we will actually change the policy formation process to pay more attention to the distributional aspects of the growth patterns and somewhat less attention just to sort of the top line kind of version. And I think if that happens, that will actually produce a very healthy Having said that, the relationships between the United States and China, I think, will remain largely solid, and the reason is mutual. These are two countries whose futures, I think, depend to a very great degree on cooperation. And the benefits or the costs of failure to implementation on both ways. So I don't think there's anything cataclysmic about that. And having said that, there are stresses and strains, and there's likely to be some friction. Both presidential candidates have run on platforms pushed largely by domestic political forces that are anti-trade, anti-China. I think, unfortunately, based on not so much misinformation, but
我们现在还没开始呢。
when the candidate, particularly say Donald Trump, when he talks about China, he's talking about a China whose policies, were in place 15 years ago.
因为你没有提前跟我说出来的事情，从这开始到这儿。那我
But that doesn't seem to have anything to do with what gets said domestically. So I think you're going to have domestic pressures that will play out in the political process.
帮我把这个麦克放到最前面去，放到他的那个讲台上面。
And they will play out trade, they will play out investment, and none of them will be new, but they're probably a bit more new. And there is a very good that we're entering a period in which broad support for a relatively and increasingly open global system is shaping. At least it's a little hard to predict how that's going to go. Finally, I can't help but mention, I think many of you in this room are involved in this. But we have a really major challenge with respect to employment work, skills, coming up. Essentially because of technological revolution, robotics, sensors, sensors, 3D printing, enormous
那些什么在百威他们那边说要放个录音了，
这是谁放的？
就是百威说需要放的。
我们放前面就行了，我们这怎么给他放前面？
对，
你就让他自己在这边。
of moving, I would say virtually every economy in the direction, not overnight, but in that direction, creates challenges that face trousers in terms of employment, prepared for the workforce, kind of jobs that are actually on offer, challenges of the model, now for China, I think some of this technology is coming along at exactly the right moment. But nobody, including China, is going to be free of this question of, well, what are people going to do? Are you going to have a kind of dual structure in the economy where there are people who benefit enormously from growth patterns that have these characteristics, and other people who kind of are in the sort of lower productivity service industries that don't pay as well, and so on. These are challenges that I think, if we recognize them and then work together, we can kind of get our arms around them. But it's sort of early stages in that. Bottom line, I don't think there's any scenario I can think of other than a miracle that has the developed countries in anything other than a sort of pretty modest sort of economic performance in terms of growth, with the other challenges that I mentioned. And when you combine low growth with rising inequality, you've got a very toxic mix. I mean, you've had rising inequality in China for a long, long time, at least by the standard measures. But that's in the context of growth. It's in the sort of, let's call it 6 to 10% range. That's really different than having rising inequality when growth is 0 or 1%, because at those rates, when you have rising inequality, somebody's actually losing in absolute terms. And that I think, is the challenge that we face in the developing countries, and that's going to make it difficult on the sort of international front. Last comment, when you look at the G20 or attempts to coordinate in a positive way internationally, economically, we do make progress over long periods of time. But the simple truth is that Danny Roderick is right. There is a contradiction in the way we're organized, which is globalization, unleashes a set of forces that run right through about borders, have nothing to do with the structure or the way we're governed on a national basis. So the G20 gets together and they sort of talk about what ought to happen, and it's probably a good thing that they talk. But then these people go back to their countries and are subject to all the domestic pressures, and it's pretty clear the G20 isn't a place where you can implement much of anything, or at least there's a challenge on that front. And I guess the message I'm delivering today is, whatever those domestic forces are that pull leaders back, and make it very difficult to sort of have a kind of coherent, fully kind of globalized type of discussion leading to a strategy, those forces are now more powerful, at least in the countries, that are struggling with growth and this rising inequality. And so I think you can expect it to be harder for even well-intentioned leaders to be fully constructive on things related to sort of international relations. So I think we'll mountaineer through it because of mutual interest, but it'll be a rocky and bumpy road. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 非常感谢 Spence 教授给我们的精彩的演讲。Spence 教授不仅是一个卓越的学者，他对实际的经济发展的情况也非常了解。 他是联合国增长委员会的担任过联合国增长委员会的主席。这个增长委员会的成员都是一些对政策特别有影响的成员，包括周小川行长。在我们国家制定“15规划的过程中，Spence 教授也是带着一个团队做了很深入的研究提出了非常有见地的建议所以我们今天听到他讲这么多很有我们
because he is really involved. In terms of policy making and policy implementation, yes, he has said now maybe we rely too much upon monetary policy, but we also need structural reforms, and in particular we need fiscal measures. But structural and fiscal measures have difficulties in terms of the implementation. Why? For the monetary policy in the United States, it's made by the Federal Reserves, which is less susceptible to political pressure. But for structural measures, including fiscal policies, they are more politicized. Moreover, globalization to different population groups has exerted different impact. So in developed countries like the US and Europe, there is some trend towards against globalization. The two presidential candidates in the United States also have a clear stance against trade or against free trade. That is the unfavorable policy environment. In that way, how can we still maintain a very positive growth development momentum? That is a big challenge. In the discussions and the debates, for example, at the G20 meetings, when leaders got together, yes, they have discussed issues of common concern, but when they go back home, they still will have to be subject to domestic pressures, and they have to have some setbacks. That is a major challenge. So globalization means different things to different people. Moreover, we are also seeing the fast development of new technologies. They can be revolutionary, and people also have different responses. And what will be the impact of new technologies upon income distribution? Too early to tell, but definitely there will be an impact, or even a big impact. And what will be its challenges to global policy making? So his ideas are very inspiring to us. We need to, in fact, have more time to digest. So now we are prepared to have a panel discussion. That's the next item on the agenda. For the panel discussion, who are our panelists? We have representatives of our program, our Entrepreneur Fellows program. They are going to have a dialogue with Professor Spence. And the theme is the company's response to financial crisis. We have Fu Hengke, who is president for Greater China of Emerson Network Energy Company. He is one of our program's fellows. And then we have Yang Xiaoping, who is vice chairman of a Chapai Group, a member to the CPPCC. We also have Mr. Zhao Xuejun, party secretary and the president to Harvest Fund Management Company. Of course, we also have Professor Spence. Yeah, take a seat. We don't have any formal seating arrangement. Take a seat where you like. Let me try to be a good moderator. So this panel is about the business response to financial crisis. So Professor Spence, you are ready? Well, but the precondition or one question is whether or not we will have another financial crisis. So Professor Spence, what's your idea? Will we have another financial crisis? Because, globally, there are quite some economic risks. What are the most important economic risks now? And will they really lead to another financial crisis?
In some ways, I think this is, from a kind of macroeconomic point of view, the hardest question to answer. So I think there isn't a definite answer. But I think if we stay on this course, we will have either an economic or financial crisis or a political crisis. With these interest rates, two things happen. One, debt rises. It's rising everywhere. And if you have low interest rates for an indefinite period of time, in spite of the diligence of the regulators, eventually people are going to decide it's okay. And secondly, debt overhangs that should be dealt with aggressively, whether they're in banks or in sovereigns, can just sit there. And I will cite the country that I live in, which is Italy. Italy has a sovereign debt to GDP ratio of 135%. If the yields on our sovereign debt were not being held down by an implicit, threat from the ECB, we'd be out of business, and we'd have to restructure our debt in order to function. But we can live for a long time, with a spread between our 10-year bond and the German Bund, of under 100 basis points, which is where it's sitting now. But we don't want to live for a long time with 135% debt to GDP ratio because it constrains the government, in doing all kinds of things. And we're an economy that's actually in negative growth. I don't mean to spend all the time on Italy, but this is an example, of what happens in a kind of very low interest rate environment like this. So I think the answer is, maybe that doesn't just blow up. Maybe the central banks can sit on it more or less indefinitely, but eventually, with unfunded pension funds, governments that don't seem to be able to do something, it's very hard for me to convince myself that you can just stay on the path. Zhang Yu.
您刚才最后提到这个
Yes, just you have talked about unfunded pension funds. Unfunded pension funds. Still, maybe some people don't know this yet. Where the interest rate is very low, yet the return rate of investments is also very low. But who is going to pay to the social security funds? So many of them maybe are really unfunded. If such a business goes on as usual, that really is risky. As Professor Spence has said, low interest rates will also create a lot of problems. For example, rising debt and unfunded social security funds. Now let me turn to our three Chinese entrepreneurs. So you come from different organizations. How will you respond to such a dilemma or such a moribund situation, such a highly risky environment? If really there is a crisis, how will you respond? Do you have any contingency plans? Shall we start from you? For financial crisis outbreak, well, maybe I have three observations or suggestions. First, to try to sell something good immediately, and you need to make a fast decision, otherwise there will be bad consequences. So you need to be very sensitive, and also you need to know that as long as you can sell something, you have money, then you can still come back one day. In the 1998, my company Chartai Group also was subject to the impacts of the Asian financial crisis, and so we immediately sold some assets. But when you are too late to sell, you don't sell for a good price. And the second, so prepare for the rainy day. So do a good job in terms of risk management and control, especially those indicators. Try to be sensible and rational, but still don't go too far. So the next question is about how to balance what is most appropriate. You should be the last to fall in your industry or in your region. That should be your bottom line. If you really are the last to fall in your industry, then I think you are a very secure guy, a safe guy. But if you are a global company, a multinational, you should be the last to disappear in your industry. In that way, you still have left a glorious chapter in history.
Spence 教授在今天演讲里开 In the very beginning of Michael Spence's opening remarks, he touched on something really important. That is to say, currently the global economy was still in the process of structural adjustment or the low growth rate global equilibrium. He talked about those two concepts. Then first, the concept means we still have a very good opportunity of recovering back to high level, but the other concepts that probably the low growth rate is going to be maintained at a low level. I think that's something that inspired me a lot today. Actually raised one question that I didn't thought before. Against a background of low growth rate of equilibrium, do we have a higher evaluation of asset price or lower asset price? Why do I have to mention that issue? Because if the financial crisis is going to outbreak, the most important problem is the shrinking of market liquidity. And in that case, how are we going to try to make sure that we have sufficient cash flow for the enterprises? But for overwhelming parts of the enterprises, if you are heavily indebted and then you further expanded the debt on the other hand, and that is based on the current asset price. If the enterprise is going through the second round of devaluation, so in that case maybe the debt level is too high. So that point really is inspiring to me. Currently, I don't have any conclusion, that is to say, against the background of the slow growth rate and the global equilibrium. Are we going to try to have a high asset price, or are we going to try to have a lower asset price?
Mike, do you want to answer this first?
Just very quickly. Right after the crisis and the central banks coordinated and responded quickly, they basically prevented a credit lockup and saved the global economy. So that part was good. Then they set out basically to drive down both short and long-term interest rates through the quantitative easing programs deliberately, to force people out in the risk spectrum, and they drove up, equity prices for a while. And so if you got on that bandwagon and you were an investor, you did pretty well for about 3 or 4 years, maybe 5. And then it hit a limit, as far as I can see, and the limit it hit was you can't have a divergence between asset prices and the underlying economic fundamentals forever. So that was driven largely by interest rate monetary policy and not by underlying economic performance on average. I mean, there's outperforming companies and sectors in all economies for sure. So now you have elevated asset prices and they're not going up. So you don't get the return that you got in that first 5 years, right? And so the question is, what happens now? And my answer to that is, with or without a shift in monetary policy, you're very likely to get a reset downward in these asset prices and a negative hit to growth in places where it hurts. I think that's almost inevitable.
如果咱们有像Spence 教授说的
If the asset price is going to be reset, it's because of the result of the monetary policy adjustment. Another possible explanation is the financial performance of the global enterprises are not so good. And if that adjustment happens, and what kind of impact will that produce to the financial market? And what kind of impact will that produce to the market? Actually, when I was thinking this issue, it's a global debt issue, and especially the easy monetary environment. In China, actually what people are worried the most are as follows. The first, debt. Over-debted level from government to enterprises. The other one is asset and property, especially housing price bubble. The third one is the debt level of the financial institutions. Because China's economy is pretty scattered, people have potential worried the exchange rate in China. I think in the long run, the Chinese RMB yuan could be depreciated, but it won't be depreciated in a very large degree. So I think the potential problem caused is the liquidity issue. When that happens, I think if the PBOC and the Central Bank of China is going to take some measures, it definitely can prevent it from going worse. Yeah, when the asset price is adjusted, definitely we have some problem in liquidity. At this time, a PBOC or central bank is going to provide liquidity, but how? That's really challenging. To whom and how are we going to try to provide liquidity to the market? I think that's a very challenging question. Last year, when the stock market is adjusting here in China, when we review what happened in last June, I think we still have much room for further improvement to make it better. That is to say, we can try to take some cautious or preventive measures. And in that case, even something happened, we are not very much, worried. Yeah, that's right. So for CSIC, they took some measures to control the crisis from going further. But sometimes they might, go in the wrong direction. I would like to share with you my thoughts regarding how enterprise is going to counter the crisis. I think first, cash flow is the very important indicator we have to monitor. Because when cash flow has some problem, the liquidity would be a big problem. So cash flow is really important. And on the other hand, we have to take a look at the change of the exchange rate and also bad debt level of the customer. And we have to keep close eyes on the exchange rate. The second point is that we still have to keep a very high level of profit level. We have to do that from the following aspects. For example, first, we're going to try to abandon some contract with very, very shabby profits. The second one is that we have to work pretty hard to lower the cost to make sure that the enterprise is going to have a very good profitability level. And thirdly, we have to have constant input in research and development, because when the crisis happens, we have some structural adjustment. We will have some new industry rises. So if we can try to keep constant inputs into some cutting-edge industry, that's going to be very much important. Just now, we asked the professor whether the financial crisis will happen or not. I think we have little impact caused by the natural disaster, but geopolitical factor is going to produce the immediate and very far-reaching impact. For example, take Russia as an example. It is a result of geopolitics. And some people are very much optimistic about the relationship between China and Russia. But whether we have the financial crisis or economic crisis in the future really depends on the relationship between China and Russia. We have 7 billion population in the world. Only 1.5 billion population who are wealthy, but the other 5.5 billion people are still living in poverty. So the easy monetary policy are not be channeled into the real economy, so the asset price is going to swell. So someday in the future, it will go bust. And So in China, in the developed economies, maybe they can't use too much the administrative forces, but in China, we can rely on those administrative measures. I think that is a challenge for the establishment of the new world order. Just now, Professor Spence has already mentioned that maybe geopolitical conflicts might trigger some financial crisis or economic crisis. That's why the relationship between China and the United States is facing the potential factors, potential worries in this regard. So what can we do if what you said is true? And if we interpret it as a risk, what can we do to prevent this risk from occurring into reality? Thank you.
Well, I think a good example is climate change. So the two leaders, these are the two healthiest economies broadly that are really big and systemically important in the world. You can't count on Europe right now. There are just too many problems. An immigration crisis, a flawed structure, much lower growth, it's, Brexit, it just goes on, conflict with Russia, etc. It just goes on and on. So I think climate change is a good example, that when it really matters, the leadership of the two countries get together and they forge an agreement and take action that basically affects the way the whole world functions. And I think the same can be done in other areas. That is, if the United States and China act together, and in the climate change example is not the only example, but a good example of doing that, then it affects the whole trajectory of the global economy. We can do the same thing in responding to crises, etc. So I'm actually pretty optimistic about that, provided we end up with leadership in the United States that's pretty firm. There's a difference in governance structure, obviously, between the two countries, but if there's somebody to work with on the American side, and I have every reason to think there will be, regardless of the outcome of the election, then these two countries have an enormous capacity and responsibility to stabilize the global economy and financial system.
刚才杨先生也谈到说，他说有一个障碍就是富人的。
Just now, Mr. Yang has already mentioned that how are we going to try to partially channel or distribute the wealth from the wealthy people to the people who live in poverty. I think that is an issue mattering, the distribution of income. I think that's a razor sharp issue. The reason why the general election in the United States of America has the problem as what we have already observed, I think it's related to the unfair income distribution in the United States of America. So what's your comment in this regard, Mr. Yang? Huh? Mike.
So I don't think there's a simple answer to this, but sitting on your hands worrying about it is not the answer either, right? So part of the answer is just redistributing income, and the reason for that is not just because it's fair, but because people invest in themselves and their children, in their own human capital. And if they're poor enough, they can't make the investment, so they can't make the adjustments to this rapidly shifting economy. So even if you don't care about the unfairness, but you do care about the ability of people to invest in themselves, in their skills, in their human capital, you would do that. Then I think the public sector has a role in sort of helping people understand what direction the economy is going. I was talking with some people at the Council on Foreign Relations recently, and a guy who's named Ted Alden, who's just written a book. He said, this is just an anecdotal statistic, but it gives you an example. In Denmark, they spend 2% of GDP on programs to retrain people to accommodate. In the United States, we spend 1/10 of 1% on retraining and reskilling, okay? Now, I'm not saying we should be the same as Denmark.